Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to take this opportunity to continue our discussion with respect to the feature film filmography from that great, one-of-a-kind, extraordinary filmmaker and artist whose name is David Cronenberg. That brings us to a work which is from 1970, and it is called Crimes of the Future. So before we get into a specific detailed discussion of the specific plot points and themes of the film, let us talk in general terms about this, and especially for those who have not yet seen this film, Crimes of the Future. I would strongly recommend it, especially if you are a fan of the works of David Cronenberg and you are on a type of journey. In many ways, this is a quintessential work by Cronenberg. There are so many themes and interests and concerns embedded within the style and content of Crimes of the Future that one can say and one can identify as being very Cronenberg-esque in a manner of speaking. This film is touching upon themes of science fiction and horror. This film is also touching upon those themes in an arguably quite cerebral way. And I mean that in a positive light because it is looking at certain genre points, but looking at them from arguably quite different perspectives. Thus, in a manner of speaking, it could be said to be a film that is a different shade of light upon a type of story that could otherwise be, say, within the confines of a particular genre or a particular set of genres. And this is, I think, very much apropos of the approach of Cronenberg in this and other films. He seems to have his connections with certain genre traditions, whether it be a type of, maybe we'll see later in his filmography, connections with the drive-through horror genre, or maybe connections with so-called B-movies or special effects, science fiction extravaganzas, etc. But they will always be films that are also taking different perspectives, different routes through and in the context of these various genres, thus turning them into very much a Cronenberg take on the particular theme or style or substance. I think that can arguably be said, too, of this work from 1970, Crimes of the Future. It is very cerebral. It is very much driven by a certain focus on narrative and visual representations that have perhaps arguably, in one sense, a type of disjointed nature, due perhaps to the technical aspect of the creation of the film. Much like an earlier work called Stereo, this film, Crimes of the Future, has a narration of the main character, played by Ronald Mlodzik. The narration of his character overlaid or laid onto the visuals. There is no sound sourced from the visuals per se. Primarily the sound comes from this narration. However, there are also intermittently applied to various aspects of the film's soundscape. We have other sounds embedded as well. So this adds, I think, yet another layer, which is still, though, very much in keeping with the idea of the sound and the visual landscape, and there may or may not be a sense of connection or disjointedness vis-a-vis those two elements, much like the earlier work Stereo. This is a film that is also dealing with Cronenberg themes in that it is talking about sexuality, it is talking about the drive or propulsion towards a sort of evolutionary solution to a certain world problem that presents itself within the world of Crimes of the Future. And query whether such evolutionary step forward is indeed a step forward, or perhaps it is a regressive point, or perhaps query whether this is a type of evolutionary step forward that can be said to be voluntary, or perhaps it is, on the contrary, involuntary or forced due to, as I say, certain specific aspects of the plot and environment and settings, which we will talk in more detail in the latter half of this video. So in those and other ways, my friends, this is very much a Cronenberg film tour de force in those, I think, aspects of theme and content. Now, I think for those who are perhaps watching the film Crimes of the Future for the first time, it may or may not be your cup of tea. Even if you are a fan of the works of Cronenberg, this might not necessarily be something that you are into, much like the earlier work Stereo. And I must say, too, that it's often the case that Stereo and Crimes of the Future are maybe grouped together. Usually it's due to the similarities that are often regarded with respect to the style and the technical aspects of that style, the sound and the narration over certain visuals, which is also true of Stereo. It's almost identical with Crimes of the Future, although, as I indicated, there are some differences. But that is one way I think that the films can be linked. Also, they come very close in proximity. They are also linked by the appearance of Ronald Mlodzik, and also they have they're very similar in terms of running time, etc. So, and much like, say, a release like this, which is the single disc release from Arrow, David Cronenberg's early works, it has Stereo and Crimes of the Future, as well as other short works as well. But these are the primary, say, feature film length aspects of this particular release. So, in that way, those two, I think, are oftentimes linked together or coupled together. And indeed, I could say that in terms of, say, themes and approach, Stereo and Crimes of the Future do have a lot of similarities. So I think that combination, or that double billing, if you will, is very apt. At the same time, of course, they are very distinct. And I'll try to get to reasons why I think they are distinct in terms of storyline structure, and also in terms of a type of a denouement resolution to the various problems that are posed, the hypotheses to the various issues that arise and that are identified in each. I think there are similarities, but there are also differences, and I'll try to explain why that is in the latter half of this video. But then going back to, say, for those who are watching this film for the first time, or are thinking about watching this film for the first time, again, it may or may not be for you. And if you are not so fond of this film, Crimes of the Future, that's okay too. You can be a big fan of David Cronenberg's works, and still maybe this film might not necessarily work for you. That's totally fine. That's absolutely fine. There's nothing that says you have to like this film, or you have to be able to engage with this film fully and wholeheartedly. So that's totally okay if you don't feel that way. However, I must say that for me personally, while I wouldn't necessarily consider it to be in my very favorite batch of Cronenberg films, I think that it holds so much in terms of the way it causes me to feel certain senses of repulsion. Also, it makes me feel disgusted, and I think that's a very positive thing, because I think that's one of the points of the film. There are some truly disturbing turns that this film takes, and really disturbing and quite gross. And I think that level of grossness is perhaps shown not necessarily through the direct nature of the visuals, but rather what is suggested. And so I think that the idea, or the intellectualization of those ideas, which might not necessarily find voice in a direct representation of special effects, visual extravaganza, etc. In this case, Crimes of the Future, I think on the contrary, there aren't any of those sorts of setups. But those concepts of the disturbing and the repulsive and the quite cold and almost sinister, those concepts, I think, hold very true and ring very true, and they are established in that Cronenberg style of the reliance on the narration, as well as what is hinted at once between the shots, between the edits, on a plane that exists almost in an ethereal nature, but still exists all the same in the hands of the artist David Cronenberg. And so in those ways, I think this film holds a lot of power and so much significance. At the very least, it holds great significance as a very important work of the filmmaker David Cronenberg. So this is the work Crimes of the Future. One last thing before we get into a specific discussion. Please note that once again, this is the Blu-ray, the Region B single disc release of David Cronenberg's early works, which includes Stereo and Crimes of the Future, as well as early short films, Transfer and From the Drain. I prefer this Arrow release because it gives the option to have subtitles as well. And I think in particular films like Stereo and Crimes of the Future, I think the dialogue or the narration I consider to be really important, really, really important. And so I always want to catch what is being said precisely, because the vocabulary is very often, it seems very almost academic or esoteric, but that's also part of the point of films like Stereo and Crimes of the Future. And so I find it very valuable to have the optional subtitles there. Incidentally, too, if you are interested in finding this in other formats, for example, you can find it, for instance, as one of the supplements of this Blu-ray release from Blue Underground, which is Fast Company. Also, the Criterion Collection has released a number of David Cronenberg works, one of which being at spine number 777, this one, which is The Brood, and one of the supplements on this particular release of The Brood by the Criterion Collection is the film Crimes of the Future. So please, you can check out one of those other options if you are interested. But with that, my friends, let us now venture into a specific discussion of Crimes of the Future now. So if you haven't seen the film, then I would suggest that maybe you can turn off this video now and come back at a time that that is convenient to your schedule, and then you and I continue our discussion about this work from 1970, which is called Crimes of the Future. So you're back, and so let us have a detailed discussion of what is going on in this film, Crimes of the Future. It is a very strange, a fascinatingly strange work, and I think that has a lot to do with the story and how it's presented. So what is the story of Crimes of the Future? What is it about? So it seems to be about, at some point in time, in some part of the world, which isn't, I think, directly identified in the universe of the film, at least as we see it, but we understand that it is some point in the future, perhaps due, I think, in large part to the fact that the title is Crimes of the Future. And we meet a group of people, one of which is dressed in this black attire, this coat, and he's wearing glasses. He has slightly long hair, and he identifies himself through the narration, which we also assume is the voice of the same person, I think. He, therefore, assuming that the narration voice is the same as this particular individual on screen, we assume, therefore, that he identifies himself as Adrian Tripod, who is the director of this place. And this place he also recognizes or identifies as being the House of Skin. Now, what is the House of Skin? It seems to have used to be a house that was headed by or run by someone, a mysterious figure, described as being the mad dermatologist Antoine Rouge. And this House of Skin was described in the past as being a clinic for wealthy persons or wealthy patients who were suffering from severely pathological skin conditions induced by contemporary cosmetics. So that seems to have been a primary purpose of this place, this clinic called the House of Skin, back in the day, in the past, when it was headed by one mysterious figure, the mad dermatologist Antoine Rouge. But that was then, seemingly, and now this is now, seemingly. And so we get the sense or the hunch that times have changed. one of the ways that we think or we see that times have changed is we don't seem to see anyone that seems to correspond to this character of Antoine Rouge, at least directly. We see someone who seems to correspond to Adrienne Tripod, who is now the head of this place, House of Skin, and we see two other people who we assume are the ones that the narration identifies later in the film as being Adrienne Tripod's two sullen interns who seem to be engaged in a type of power struggle against Adrienne Tripod for control and authority of the House of Skin. And so already in this first sequence, we get a lot of stuff here, not to mention one of the residents. He could be a patient. We assume that he is a patient of Adrienne Tripod and the two sullen interns, but he is also described as being a resident, and this resident, who has her long curly hair, is being observed in particular by Adrienne Tripod, and also he seems to be suffering from what is referred to as Rouge's malady. And Rouge's malady is a type of illness or sickness or infection. We're not quite sure exactly what. We're not sure if it's a virus or venereal disease or something, but we do know that the effects of, or the symptoms of, this particular sickness or illness, again, Rouge's malady, is an secretion from the body of a type of whitish substance. It is referred to also colloquially perhaps as Rouge's foam. Adrienne Tripod in the narration also describes it as a whitish, aerated, amorphous affluence oozing from certain orifices of the body. And this is observed in, as I say, this particular resident patient in the House of Skin. And the secretion comes from various parts. At one point, the narration describes it as oozing out of his ears. Another point, it seems to be coming out from his chest, mammary gland. And so this whitish substance, which seems to resemble a cream of some sort, is then consumed or devoured by certain people that we see. One of the interns seems to be devouring or licking some of the substance that is collected on his hand, and also to Adrienne Tripod. Now, what this means, what this signifies, is anyone's guess, but I think one of the connotations is perhaps sexual, in terms of a sexual attraction or attractive nature of this particular patient vis-a-vis the people who are, say, the scientists or the researchers, or we assume they are. And this is one of the points, I think, where we see a connection with the earlier work Stereo. If we recall, in that work, which was involving or it was discussing the researcher-subject dynamic in the context of the telepathic conglomerate, and the way in which the theories of Luther Stringfellow involved, among other things, the idea of a subjective viewpoint that was that needed to be relied upon in order to further the telepathy psychic study, experimentation. In other words, everything had to be subjective, and part of that subjectivity was almost a sexual attraction between researcher and student, thus forming a basis for the initial stages of the telepathic conglomerate, again in the context of Stereo. Here, in Crimes of the Future, I think we can see the suggestion of something also very similar. There seems to be this type of attraction. At the very least, we can say that certain scenes of Adrienne Tripod looking at this particular patient or resident, there's a particular scene that I find quite almost, it's very disturbing when he takes off his glasses, Adrienne Tripod does, as he's looking from one of the corners of the building at this particular person, and he licks the inside lens of his glasses, and he puts his glasses back on. Now that can be said to be also something that is maybe innate part of the culture, which is again part of the future. Maybe this is an everyday thing of the culture, but it seems very almost gross and repellent. from the viewpoint of, say, when I watch the film. And I think that's also part of the point. So there's something of a maybe attractive nature, something that involves the physical touching of his tongue to an object that is, again, used for sight to look at this particular individual. We also see him licking or consuming what is known as Rouge's foam. And I should also say, too, that the effect, too, or the consequence of the secretion of Rouge's foam seems also to be death. It is described to as a deadly emergence, and indeed we come to understand that this particular person will die, and he indeed dies. We also see not just the secretion of Rouge's foam, we also see blood as well at some stage. And so this is also carried on in terms of, or this is used as a basis for a further explanation of the world and the universe of Crimes of the Future, namely that it seems like there has been this type of catastrophe that has hit the world, wherein we have this mysterious illness that has essentially wiped out a very significant part of the population, namely that part of the population that is a post-pubescent female. And so the post-pubescent female population has been wiped out or eradicated due to some mysterious illness we assume is this Rouge's malady. And so now we have a consequence of this being that Antoine Rouge seems to have disappeared, and also the House of Skin is now run by Adrian Tripod. And also we have only seemingly a world that is populated by men. Now this becomes important, I think, later in the film when we talk about the idea of forced evolutionary progress or regressive evolution, and what that means in terms of a psychological and sexual consequence in terms of the dynamics of human relationships. And we'll talk about that in the latter half, regarding the latter half of this film. But for now, I think those dominoes are being set up right now, because now we understand that perhaps due to a significant portion of the population being eradicated or wiped out, now we have the surviving men, and perhaps we see a result of this, this new order of sorts, and how this affects people's viewpoints. And perhaps this can also be said to be a type of development of human sexuality. Sexuality also being a term used to describe the way in which humans are attracted to other humans. And so I think this is setting the stage for a science fiction element, as well as the element of a discussion or treatment of human evolution in the hands of David Cronenberg. So this is very important. Also, the idea of fluids and the secretion of fluids is it has this gross element to it, I think, a repellent nature to it, but I think that's also part of the point, because I think we're meant to feel the horrific nature of this, but it's also there's also a type of sexual bent to it, because, as I say, not only are these secretions gross, but they are also consumed and licked, and indeed perhaps almost sought after by Adrian Tripod and others. And so there is a sexual element as well as a deadly, or perhaps type of devastating element emerged into a single image of Rouge's foam. And I think if we think of other films maybe later in the Cronenberg filmography, in particular a film like, say, Crash, where we have a type of fusion between sex and death, I think we might find potency in the argument that maybe that fusion between sex and death can also be found also in the image or metaphor of Rouge's foam that we see here in Crimes of the Future. But again, that's a discussion to be continued when we reach, say, a film like Crash. But for now, we have this setup of the world. And it seems also that the illness or the sickness, this mysterious malady, Rouge's malady, seems to have had only been apparent in the the females of post-puberty. But now we see an example of a young man, again, the resident of the House of Skin, dying due to what we understand to be Rouge's malady. So here is the setup of Crimes of the Future. So now we have a lot going on, and throughout this we have the narration, we have certain sounds that are also seemingly intermittently added that are maybe quite jarring. There's almost a percussion type quality to it. They seem to be taken from nature. We'll also see later in the film those similar types of soundscapes intermittently added, sounds of what seem to be birds or crackling or other types of drum beats that might be meant to evoke or mimic, say, gunshots, etc. There will be a scene maybe close to the climax of the film that involves a gun and involves a type of takeover, perhaps, of sorts, and a kidnapping of sorts involving a little girl, and we'll get to that later. But the point that, to be drawn here is that there seems to be a soundscape type of disjointed quality, and the world seems to be in a sense of maybe upheaval or askew, or something is out of whack. The balance of the world seems to be out of whack, and we get a sense of this once again in the way that sounds and images seem to not necessarily be totally in sync. But again, I think that is part of the point. We're meant to feel a little bit off kilter, a little bit strange, a little bit uneasy. And we get that both subliminally and directly. And so that's the setup, I think, so far of Crimes of the Future. Now, from here we get a type of journey of the person, Adrian Tripod. We see him going to a particular set of gates, and then we see sudden cuts to different, similar looking, but still distinctly different setups and environments. So for instance, we see him in a next setup, which is an indoors place with some windows that seems to be different from the environmental landscape space of the earlier place that we understood to be the House of Skin. So now we seem to be in a new place, and it's described by the narration as being Institute of Neo-Venereal Disease. And it's also described as being during the time of Antoine Rouge. There seems to have been much collaboration, whatever that means, between this Institute of Neo-Venereal Disease on the one hand and the House of Skin on the other. And we also see Adrian Tripod meeting, who is described as being a former colleague. And this person is sitting, and there are these jars of colored liquid nearby. And what is the situation? Well, it seems like, according to the narration, we have this idea of a person who contracted a type of what's described as a species of venereal disease from one of his patients. So there is also a link with stereo. Again, that dynamic of researcher, subject, and the subjective viewpoint of the process of Luther Stringfellow's theories, and the telepathic conglomerate being dependent on a type of dominant, subdominant dynamic. Here, perhaps there's a hint of that there. Someone who seems to be a former colleague, which suggests a researcher or scientist position, somehow or another has contracted a venereal disease from one of his patients. So, he was once a fierce sensualist, but now he's a pure metaphysician, as the narration goes. And also it seems like his body seems to be creating puzzling new organs that, when removed, are replaced by yet other unique and puzzling new organs. And it seems like these organs are very complex, perfect, unique, and seemingly without function. And so here we have, and also it's described too that this person steals the organs because they are in storage, or they're in these jars, but he steals them because he feels like the organs are his body is a galaxy, and the organs are solar systems, which is another way to say that he feels like he is alone unless he is together with these surgically removed organs that seem to have no specific function. And also it's the narration describes this person as having a disease which seems to be in the form of a creative cancer, which is an interesting, very paradoxical dynamic. But I think the word creative is used because of the creation of these new body parts or these new organs, and cancer in terms of perhaps the destructive nature of this act of creation. So herein again we have another theme echoed in the David Cronenberg universe. this can be said to be similar to stereo, but also very distinct from stereo. And this is, I think, a really important point. And we'll see it echoed later in the film Crimes of the Future, but here it's this. Both films, and indeed other films of Cronenberg, can be said arguably be talking about certain aspects of steps in the human evolutionary ladder. Steps in what one might say to be the future of humanity. And in stereo, we had the idea of the human evolution expressed in the telepathic abilities, the induced telepathic abilities of those Category A subjects. Here, in this particular example of Crimes of the Future, we have this person of the Institute of Venereal Disease having contracted a certain species of venereal disease, and now his body is creating organs, new organs that are then generated again once they are surgically removed. So, and it's described as being a form of creative cancer. So it seems like, therefore, some kind of creation equals the steps towards human evolution, but at the same time it's described as cancer, so it's regressive or destructive. Now, I think that's the key. In stereo, it could be argued, although I think it could go both ways, but it could be argued that the step in the evolutionary ladder was, generally speaking, positive. This was the Stringfellow hypothesis in that film. Here, it could be said, or this example could be said to be regressive or negative, destructive at the same time, and not just destructive in terms of a replacement of the old order with a new order, but destructive to the actual thing or being that is evolving at that point. And so here we have that wonderful, almost contradictory dynamic, which is, I think, very much part of the Cronenberg universe in a beautiful way in many films. Here, it's captured in this image of creative cancer and the replacement of organs with new organs. And these organs seem to be gross and disgusting, but they are growths. But oftentimes, too, cancers, too, are growths, and they are destructive growths. So perhaps here we have human evolution equals destruction. So, and it equals some kind of negative force. So this is, I think, a really important distinction that maybe we will see echoed in other films by Cronenberg later down the line. So let's keep that in mind here as well. I should say here, too, just skipping ahead to the later part of the film, Crimes of the Future, we do have a discussion when we get to the group headed by the character who's described as being named Jomkin, and it's described as being the gathering of conspirators who are also understood to be what is described by the film or the narrator as being heterosexual pedophiles, which is pedophilia is also outlawed in this world of Crimes of the Future, and the discussion of Jomkin is dealing with the aquaria, or the attraction to the spheres, or attraction to perverse multidimensional images, and also the discussion here is about a type of novel sexuality, sexuality that seems to be coming about because of the absence of a significant part of the population due to Rouge's malady. At least that's the assumption that one can make. So in other words, this idea of a novel sexuality being developed is another way, or another example of, say, the progress or steps towards some kind of human evolutionary process. But at the same time, we will see, again, in the context of the storyline of these conspirators, that they will, at least the three of them, will kidnap a young girl, and the implications of that are very, very horrifying indeed in terms of what they intend to do with this young girl, again, at the end of the film. And so that, I think, can also be said to be, maybe on the one hand, an indication of a type of evolution of sexuality and sexual norms, but it's also a negative thing because it has very terrible and horrific consequences, arguably so. So that's another thing where evolution equals destruction or death. So that is, again, another point to keep in mind. But now returning to the journey of the character of Adrian Tripod as we see it, and then after this visit to the Institute of Neovenereal Disease, he then is described as having gone to a new place, which is called the Oceanic Podiatry Group, and he works there as a type of therapist, we understand. And we see, too, a type of rivalry between houses, because he says, or the suggestion of a rivalry, because he describes the Oceanic Podiatry Group as having a kind of theoretical structure in part supported in part by a grossly distorted interpretation of the later writings of Antoine Rouge. And so that seems to suggest a type of maybe rivalry, in that these are like houses of royalty of sorts. And I like that image of houses of royalty, because if we go back to the earlier discussion or the description of the house of skin and the rule or the ascendancy of Rouge, that sounds like the ascendancy of a new king ruling over a particular kingdom or realm. The House of Skin here, the Institute of Neovenereal Disease, here the Oceanic Podiatry Group, etc. So I like that. That's a really interesting thing, almost regal, in how those houses, various houses or institutes or corporations are treated. But here we are now in the part of the film dealing with the Oceanic Podiatry Group. And we also get more actions or notions about evolution and regression. This time we have the idea of the invocation, or according to the narration, the invocation of the genetic history of feet. And we get here scenes of feet and the almost like tickling or pressure put on feet of some sort. It could be sexual, it could be comic, it could be both, it could be many other things. But here, as we see these images, we also hear this narration about this genetic history of feet dealing with tentacles, lobed fins, flippers, and also has a therapist. Adrian Tripod describes his job as being essentially to encourage patients to reverse the psychic relapse and to encourage patients to revert to a sudden alien gravity. In other words, I interpret this to mean that they are on the way towards having their feet turn into these say organs without function. And perhaps another way to say that is that they are evolving regressively. They're evolving in a backwards chain instead of evolving forwards. And so in a way, perhaps it could be said that Adrian Tripod's job or role as a therapist in the Oceanic Podiatry Group is in fact to reverse the flow of the regressive evolutionary track towards the path towards using the feet, as it were. Even when the patients would prefer to revert to what is described by the narration as being more primitive forms. So this is another play, almost a playful play on the flow of evolution. It goes forwards, it goes backwards, depending on the will or the force or the wishes of the particular person that is involved. And so here we have a house or podiatry, Oceanic Podiatry Group that seems to be focusing in on yet steps of evolution. Perhaps this can be said to be counter to the negative viewpoints of evolution that we have seen elsewhere in the film. This could be said to be comic or funny, or in any way positive, because it does seem to suggest, instead of rendering one's feet useless, Adrian Tripod's job here as therapist seems to be the opposite, to in fact create function with these particular feet, even if it means forcing an so-called alien gravity upon the patients. An interesting concept indeed. So here we have the playful nature of Cronenberg here, and we understand that I think it can be said that he can hold different, say, hypotheses at the same time, evolution going one way and evolution going another way, again within the context of the same film. And we also see here the notion of maybe sexual attraction, physical contact and touch, again through the appendage or the image or the actual thing of the foot itself, and how that can be a source of comedy. It also can be, we see later in this sequence, to be almost a focus or a reason or an excuse to reject. And there are moments of rejection as well. At least that's what the implication is. Characters seem to be breaking up or breaking apart. And I think there is a particular moment too where where Adrian Tripod is almost at a loss. And I think then that leads to the next sequence, which seems to be involving what is described as the metaphysical import-export. And here we understand from the narration that now Adrian Tripod is working under some kind of sense of anonymity as an intramural courier, delivering things. And we see certain items being delivered, included in which I think are articles of underclothing And so here we have yet another almost a very maybe surprising indication of certain viewpoints on sexuality, this time perhaps on certain articles of clothing that might seem to some to be associated with certain parts of the body, etc. And those associations could also be formations of a type of viewpoint or inclination that can be said to be sexual or sexual in nature, or in terms of an expression of some kind of aspect of attraction towards human sexuality. And also we have here, again, the interweaving of the way in which characters are viewing their, say, expressions of sexuality in this world, in this new world, a brave new world, perhaps another way to say it, but also the idea too of certain maybe a sense of panic, or not necessarily panic, but a sense of balance out of whack, the idea of what's described as being a morbid stasis. The word perverse is also used in the narration as well. So there is a sense here of maybe an uneasy continuity in terms of the connection with sexuality and evolution, and also, again, that discussion, we turn to evolution. Again, is it evolution in a forward direction, or is it evolution in a regressive momentum direction? So this is, again, a continuation of that fascinating and quite disturbing, I think, discussion as well. But to then continue on with, the journey, or the almost an example of, say, the job mobility of this world vis-a-vis the many jobs that Adrian Tripod seems to be able to get in what seems to be a short amount of time. But then we also get the Gynecological Research Foundation sequence, and here we have also Jomkin and the introduction of the idea of the gathering of the conspirators, or the pedophiles. And I think the word heterosexual is used here in the narration, which again harkens back to the idea, which we also saw in Stereo, which is that there might be some certain traditional norms of sexuality based around the concept of heterosexuality. But in fact, this film, or the film Stereo, and indeed Crimes of the Future, seems to be suggesting that there are other forms of sexuality or sexual expression, especially in a world like Crimes of the Future, where the population of post-puberty females has been eradicated due to Rouge's malady. So it seems like, and then this is connected to the earlier point that I was making about how perhaps this can be seen as an idea of evolution, but evolution coming about not due to some kind of voluntary or surgical process like we saw in Stereo, but evolution coming about because of some kind of forced external circumstances, namely the death of a wide spectrum of the population. Thus, query whether this step, if the evolutionary process, is a forward momentum one or a regressive backward looking one. Is it a positive step forward, or is it a negative step in the reverse direction? And I think that interpretation that it's negative is further illuminated by the fact that we are dealing with a group of people that also will be targeting a young child at the end of the film, or towards the end of the film, which is a very disturbing concept indeed. I think it's made even more disturbing by the fact that it seems like the narration seems to be suggesting that maybe the presence of Antoine Rouge is somehow embodied in or within or somehow associated with this young girl that we see. And so therein lies the final sequence of events in the film, involving certain members of this group of conspirators and an obscure hotel for transients, and also kidnapping of the girl. And I should say too that she is described as being a research import, involving prematurely induced puberty, and this state is described by the narration further as being a state that is vulnerable to the onset of Rouge's malady. And so we see, therefore, the kidnapping of this girl through an act of what we understand to be perhaps an act of violence. And also we see the hotel, and here we have the hotel for obscure hotel for transients. At this point, a number of interesting things happen. One, the narration forgoes the use of I, and instead uses the word Adrian Tripod. And so the narration refers to Adrian Tripod in the third person. So that means that there is a disassociation or disconnect, not just between sound and image by the fact that we have narration that seems to be out of joint with the image itself, but also within the bounds of the narration we have now the narrator seemingly himself disjointed with the actual concept or identity of Adrian Tripod, which we understood was in sync for most of the film up to this point. So we have a further disjointed disconnect, not just between sound and image, but between the narrator and the concept of who the narrator thinks he is, which is, I think, mind-blowing in that way. So that's one significant point of this final sequence involving the hotel. Another significant or very interesting detail is the person who's described as being the concierge, and how there's this growth, looks like nose hair, a really long nose hair coming from one of his nostrils only. But it's described by the narration as being a root-like excrescence of the cerebral nerve cells. So it seems to be an extension of the brain somehow. So again, if this is indeed the case, this is another example in the film of growths of some kind of organ that seems to may or may not have some kind of function or purpose, but they do grow. And perhaps query, if it were removed, maybe it would be replaced again, just like that person, a former colleague that we saw earlier in the Institute for Neovenereal Disease. But it's a very funny image too. You have this person with long nose hair out of one nostril only, and we have the other nostril being used for some kind of sniffing instrument. I'm not sure. That is supplied by yet another person who's there somewhat randomly. We're not sure. But it's a very funny image, so we have comedy intertwined in here. Also, it's very consistent with, as I say, the notion of growths or new growths, the idea of creative cancer. Is this a destructive growth, or is it a growth that has meaning? So is it a step in the forward propulsion of evolution, a positive step forward, or is it a backward negative step in the sense that evolution equals destruction or death? Again, I think it's a good query to have, or in terms of a possible interpretation. And then we reach the final stages of this film, which again involves the room, and the implication is that there will be some kind of attempt to impregnate this particular person, who is a young girl, which is a very disturbing, incredibly disturbing concept. And that's an example of where I find this film to be very, very disturbing and repulsive and repellent in terms of its content and where it goes. That it's dealing with it in a very sort of cerebral way, or cerebrally presented way in the style of the film. But here we see something of a twist in the action. First, we see one of the people who seems to be almost violently resisting this kind of approach or assault on this particular person. So that we don't see. But then we have the final climax, if you will, the climactic scene between this young girl and Adrian Tripod alone in the hotel room, or we assume is the hotel room. And then we see two things, or we understand two things. First, according to the narration, it seems like there is the presence of the mad dermatologist Antoine Rouge somewhere. And then we have the recognition that Rouge's foam seems to be emerging and seems to be secreted. And also there are other bodily fluids that seem to be being secreted from Adrian Tripod as well. And so therein lies the way in which this film ends, with the mystery of perhaps the suggestion of a return or resurgence or reincarnation of Antoine Rouge. We're not quite sure. Is this the return, or is this the figment of the imagination of Adrian Tripod or the narrator, if indeed they are the same or different people? Who knows? Also, we have the onset of the illness or disease, and we have to question whether or not this means the end of these people, including Adrian Tripod. We're not sure, because the film ends before we get a clear answer, but the possibility or implication is there, especially based on what we've seen at the very outset of the film. So, but we also have, again, I think, the mystery of evolution. And I think the mystery of evolution here is connected perhaps maybe indirectly or perhaps in a nuanced or subtle way with the notion of reincarnation. And so the idea too is what happens to our spirit or what happens to our essence when the corporeal form, the body, changes or turns into something different. And I think that's very much it goes hand in hand with the discussion of evolution that we see in the hands of Cronenberg in this and Stereo, but in particular this film. And again, whether this evolutionary step is a step in the positive direction or is it a step in the negative direction. And I think we can extend that consideration and pondering and discussion to a contextual discussion of evolution, again in the context of reincarnation. So is reincarnation positive or negative? I mean, that leads to various possibilities of kindred spirits or supernatural evil forces, etc., etc. So I don't know if the film goes that far because it ends before any definitive statement I think can be made in either direction. But in any event, I think the context of the human evolution and the question of the function of human evolution and the progressive nature or regressive nature of human evolution, I think is still very much it's very much in play. Very much in play as the film ends, Crimes of the Future. So this is I think in that context, this is a very strange and bizarre world that is being portrayed here. I think it's very chilling, very effective, and as I was indicating at the outset of this discussion, there are parts of this film that really repulse, they're disgust. And I think that's part of the point. That is by design. Because what I want to suggest, and again I'll close the discussion here, is even those feelings of repulsion or disgust might be support for the interpretation that, say, unlike the way in which human evolution is depicted in a film like Stereo, here in Crimes of the Future it seems like there is a negative connotation to human advancement or human evolution. That negative connotation finds or manifests itself in the perverse and outlawed nature of some of these people, especially at the end of the film when they kidnap this young girl. Or we can see it in the way that maybe people in authoritarian positions seem to be taking advantage of their subjects or their patients or their residents, etc. And that leads to terrible consequences, arguably, for instance, for someone like Adrian Tripod, if we consider his ending to be his impending death at the hands of Rouge's malady. Again, it's up to your interpretation. But I think overall and in general, this film can be said to be a discussion or treatment of evolution as a destructive force, as a negative force, or as a force of death. And that paradoxical, that very contradictory nature of evolution, I think, is something that perhaps it might be said to be different from Stereo, or maybe it was already hinted at Stereo, but it's even more pronounced here in Crimes of the Future. And if we remember too that perhaps one of the reasons, again, we're not quite sure of the causal relationship, but perhaps it can be said that there is at least a possibility of a causal relationship between this negative connotation of human evolution as a destructive force on the one hand, and the fact that perhaps it was induced by the fact that a majority of the population, again, the post-puberty females, were killed due to the onset of Rouge's malady. So maybe it was due to forced events that themselves were very destructive and deadly, namely the eradication of a majority of the population. So negative forces beget negative forces in the hands of Cronenberg, at least in the context of this particular interpretation of this film, Crimes of the Future. So, my dear friends, what do you think of this particular work, Crimes of the Future, 1970? I would very much love to hear your thoughts and comments at any time. But in the meantime, my friends, thank you so much. Thank you so much indeed for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. I will see you at the next Cronenberg film discussion. But until then, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and Cheers.